these rambling thoughts of a little naive boy. And actually I had what I describe as a God moment. Like I kind of just made a pledge. I made a decision as this tiny little kid that I wanted to become a doctor. I wanted to work overseas, and I wanted to help these people who were clearly on death's door.
This is your fortnightly instalment where I interview a trailblazing physiotherapist that has shaped the profession we are today. In celebrating their journey, knowledge and insight, you gain the opportunity to plan and guide your own professional journey. My name is Cary, and welcome to Physio+10. Welcome to past and new listeners to Physio+10. Our special guest today is Jason Smith. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Doug. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, same here. Usually start the podcast with a bit of background, like where you grew up and what your early schooling entailed.
I'm a Melbourne boy. So Glen Waverley, for any of your listeners who know that area, that was home for me. And although I've been all over, I'm back not far from Glen Waverley now. So I'm in Montana South. I did most of my schooling at a very small private Christian school, which was really a humble little start for this school. I think in year 10, which is the highest grade it went to, there were only 12 of us in the class, and there was no VCE offered. So I had to then move on to a state school, and the school I went to, which was in Sindel, it got bulldozed within a few years of me leaving, so it doesn't even exist. So yeah, hard to track now the roots of school, but yeah, they were good years. I was definitely not the smartest kid in the class, but I was probably one of the hardest working, and so made up for lack of intelligence with brute hours at the desk. And actually for a lot of it, I worked an American curriculum, believe it or not, which was a self-paced curriculum. So we didn't have a classroom teacher at the blackboard. Every kid worked out of a book that they just could call on a teacher for assistance with, but I could be sitting next to another boy or girl my age who was a year above or a year below in the curriculum, even though we're the same age, just because of the self-paced nature of the workflow. So it's a really different schooling system. Doesn't exist anymore, but it had a following in the mid-80s.
Yeah. I mean, on that, I grew up also in a very small school. Like I think we had 50 from 0 or 1 to 7. Yeah. And that certainly had influence on me as a person because it was such a small group of people that you dealt with every day. Would you say there was anything specifically from that, like, that reflects now on how you are as a person because you had such a small group of people?
It's hard to know what's causative and what just is your innate disposition. But I mean, we just had a little chat before the recording, and you described yourself as an introvert. So sorry to out you in front of everyone, but that's how you described yourself. And I would be something similar, even though my whole world is around people, with people, for people. My kids think it's hilarious because I get home and the last thing I want to do is go out and see people because I'm an introvert. Now, whether that's because I've come from small groups of very intimate relationships from a childhood where I wasn't part of big crowds, or whether that's just how I'm built, I mean, I wouldn't know, but I'm more comfortable with the smaller groups. Yeah, definitely.
So transitions then, like you moved into physiotherapy, but before you get there, were your parents in the health sphere?
They weren't. Dad comes from a long line of military, Air Force, Navy. So, they're the cliche poster family for fight them on the land, fight them on the beaches, fight them in the air. Dad himself, he did his trade as an engineer, as a fitter and turner in the Navy, and served many years on a ship there. Mum was mostly administrative. And then even when we go back into the archives, generationally, I can't find anyone who even went to university, let alone had a career in healthcare. So no, it's not. my love, my passion for all things health didn't particularly come from my parents, even though I got lots of other great things from them. My sister did dental nursing for a few years, but then she quickly jumped out of that and got into some retail and management. So, no, I can't claim the genetic roots for any of it.
So where do you fall in the family? You've mentioned your sister.
Yeah. Yeah, there's only two siblings. I'm the youngest by 3 years.
Right.
So my wife still thinks when I get on the phone and talk to mum now as a grown man, I still put my baby voice on and talk like I'm the young child in the family, seeking sympathy and advantages somehow. Yeah, so I'm the youngest, and there's only two of us. So
Yeah.
yeah.
As a child or even in your teenage years, was there something that fascinated you that on reflection maybe has gone through your life and influenced the choices that you make now as an adult?
Yeah, I mean, we think of defining moments, or I talk about defining moments a lot with people. I think the single most important event of my childhood was as a 10-year-old, and it's very clear in my mind. Like I can remember it as though it was yesterday. And I had a habit of getting up on a Saturday morning. The rest of the household was asleep. I'd watch the cartoons, in the lounge room while I'd have breakfast. And this is mid 80s. And you might remember a genre of TV commercials started to become really popular. World Vision started running those ads for $1 a day. You could sponsor a child. This was the beginnings of that whole charitable appeal that is very commonplace these days. And I used to see these images. I'd be going from Donald Duck and Roadrunner to these images of Ethiopian kids, frail, distended bellies, clearly malnourished, crying into the camera, scrawny cows walking in the background, no parents around. And as a 10-year-old boy, I just remember being totally displaced by this. Like it just arrested my attention, and I couldn't make sense of it. It's like, where are the doctors? Where are the nurses? Why aren't people giving these guys food? Why can't they go to the supermarket? These rambling thoughts of a little naive boy. And actually I had what I describe as a God moment. Like I kind of just made a pledge. I made a decision as this tiny little kid that I wanted to become a doctor. I wanted to work overseas, and I wanted to help these people who were clearly on death's door. And that little decision, or that big decision of a little kid at 10 years of age, I think set the trajectory for what then became this impassioned pursuit of all things healthcare, even though I had no kind of framework for that, no one to guide me. But if you ask a teacher or an uncle or any of my peers from back during my teenage years, if you put them under a heat lamp at 3 o'clock in the morning and interrogated them, what do you think Jason wanted to do when he grew up? They would all, I think, give you a very consistent answer, because it was my self-declared story. I'm going to be a medical missionary. Well, if you can't be a doctor, I'm going to be a nurse, but I'm going to work overseas amongst the poorest of the poor. And it gripped me, and it's never left me, frankly. My career might have gone into some unusual places, some things I didn't expect, but the idea of that has never left me. I'd say that is my most defining moment.
Do you recall then waking up or waking your parents up that Saturday morning and declaring it to
No,
them as well, or was it an internal thing?
nah, I buried it actually. I like for the first year or two, I didn't know how to process it. So no, I didn't go and wake them up. I didn't talk to them about it. I struggled with it for a little while. And the only solution, I could come up with was, well, clearly I have to become a health professional and do my bit. That was as sophisticated as a response that I could muster. And it probably wasn't actually, I mean, At some point, I would have said to mum and dad, "Hey, I want to be a doctor. Um, I need to go to uni. Uh, I'd love to work overseas." By 19, I'd made my first trip to Cambodia, working in some of the communities over there. But so at some point, I've obviously declared the tangible expression of it. But I think even the depth of conviction, the disruption that it created in my little psyche, the how formational it was to my identity, I think didn't even come out probably until my mid to late 20s, because I'd kind of come to terms with it. I could put words around it. I couldn't deny it. And I was sharing it with a greater clarity. So I carried it for a long time, Doug.
Mm.
Yeah.
So what was the trigger then not to do medicine or nursing, but actually to do physio?
Oh, well, that was easy. I wasn't smart enough to be a doctor. That's the short of it. I missed out on my VCE scores by a percentage point, a single percent. And Monash Medical School invited me to a panel of selectors to interview me for second round choices. And there was a physio sitting on that panel. So there was the dean of the faculty and a few medicos, but there was a physio sitting on that panel, and they were just quizzing me, why do you want to do this? Why should we give you one of the few spaces left? And all of my answers kind of were pretty heartfelt around this idea of wanting to go cross-culturally and work in a missional context. And at the end of the interview, they thanked me for my time, and the physio on the panel got up and ushered me to the door. And as he opened the door and saw me out, he just said, "Hey, just for what it's worth, if you're not successful here, I encourage you to look at physiotherapy, because I think all of the things that attract you to medicine, you could achieve and make meaningful contribution through physio as well." And up until that point, I got to be honest, I'd never been to a physio. I hardly knew what physios were. I hadn't attended any open days. And physio sat on my preferences as a year 12 student only because a career counsellor had said, well, let's put it in there. But in my simple little brain, it was like doctor or nurse, didn't really understand allied health in between. And as it turned out, I was unsuccessful with my second round interview. So I took up an offer at Melbourne Uni for physio, and I went in there and I cut a deal with the head of the school. And I
This
said,
sounds more like the Jason Smith we know.
yeah, I said if I do well enough in all the core subjects, which we knew first year medical students were doing with us, like anatomy and psychology and neuroscience, can I get your endorsement to swap across to medicine? And they said, that sounds fair, but let's kick that into the long grass and wait and see what happens. The end of that first year, I got the marks. I think I made the Dean's Honour list. But by that point, honestly, I was hook, line and sinker. I was passionate about physio. I was in love with it. It was more me than I think medicine ever would have been. And so stuck with it, and here I am.
Yeah. I would have said that was a pretty pivotal moment too. That because
Yeah.
if you hadn't have if you got your first round, you wouldn't have had an interview. If you hadn't had the interview, you wouldn't have met the physio.
Yep.
If they hadn't seen that spark in you, they wouldn't have walked into the door and given you that basic an interview on the spot to physio.
Yeah, I think you're right.
And it's amazing how those moments we can never expect or understand they're going to happen, but by being there,
those sliding doors, isn't it?
yeah, very much so. And you can't predict them.
Nah,
They
no,
just
you
happen.
can't. You can't take credit. You can't, and I think that's a good point, mate. You can't take credit for them.
No.
Like it's not that I was so attentive to my options. It's kind of like it happens to us, and I'm grateful for them, but I can't take credit for them.
Yeah. Do you remember who the physio was by any chance?
No, I don't,
Yeah.
and I can't even picture their face.
Yeah.
And so even if I have run into them since, I wouldn't know it. And it was kind of almost like, just that guardian angel that directed me at the right moment.
Yeah, so true.
Yeah.
You graduated in 98. What was significant for you in regards to your university experience? As you said, your mum and dad, no one else had been there.
Yeah.
Was there something specifically significant for you graduating?
I love the course. I think the physio degree was a grueling experience, but I actually loved it. Like, just it was just so built for me. It was hard work though, and I was working two jobs all through uni. I was an attendant carer, which is kind of like the old form of what an NDIS disability support worker might look like today. I was working at the bottle shop on weekends, just trying to make my way through uni. And I met my wife now during those years, and we got engaged while we were at uni. And I was leading a youth group of 13-year-olds, 150 of them. So actually, it was a grueling 4 years, right? Like, seriously, I don't know. I would go to bed at 1 a.m. I'd be up at 5 to catch the train. It was 3 hours of transit a day from where I lived to uni. I didn't stay at college. So I remember them being frantic years, but so life-giving. Like, just, I wouldn't want to do it again, but I think I sucked every minute of opportunity out of it, and yeah, really enjoyed it. So I look back and I'm very yeah, they were good years. Good tutors, great peer cohort that I went through with, many of whom I'm still connected to. We all were aspirational about our careers. Like, the sky wasn't falling at that point. We were all thinking we're out to change the world. There was a lot of optimism.
Yeah, I think that the uni years are certainly very informative, constructional on our own psyche, who we come and what we do, and
Yeah, I think so.
the friendships made there are certainly cemented. And part of that's the cauldron of fire. I think, studying with each other and practicing with each other and going through the experiences with each other for 4 years it's a great period of time for people.
Yeah, it is. It is.
So, on completing your studies, like first paycheck, freedom, professional status, what do you remember about becoming a newly minted physio?
How exhausting it was. So, I mean, I've run a lot of new staff inductions over the years for literally thousands of physios. And one of the first things I say to them is, if you're a new grad and your first year is anything like my first year, you are going to be exhausted just from the physical toll, being on your feet all day and the manual work, but the mental toll of having to rattle through all the differential diagnoses, all of the things you've learned that you're trying to compress into these consultations, the obligation you feel to people, dealing with the emotional burden of their pain, and then every 20 or 30 minutes resetting and having to go again. Like, I found it exhausting. I actually went straight into Royal Melbourne Hospital. That was my first job. And interestingly, Paulina, my wife, who actually did nursing, so she's an intensive care nurse, we got married literally a month after graduating. And we both got jobs in the intensive care unit at Royal Melbourne Hospital, and we had scheduled to start them in February of the year after. And we were on our honeymoon in Fiji, and I'm just lazing on the beach in a hammock, and one of the waiters comes up to me with a note, and I don't know how the head of the department had tracked me down here, but probably through my parents and whatnot, asking me to start early. So we kind of finished our honeymoon, shortchanged the nesting period of newlyweds, and we both started at the hospital pretty quickly and just got into it. So it was a really fun but busy year. My first patient ever, who I can remember his name, I can remember his parents' name, I can remember his circumstances. He was an 18-year-old kid who came off a motorbike on a farm, no helmet, fractured his upper cervical spine, complete quad, brain trauma, I spent 8 days, my first 8 days in the hospital, changing his Philadelphia collars and doing chest care and teaching his parents postural drainage for him. And he passed. He didn't make it. So my first patient ever, I was traumatized. Um, Fortunately, things got better from there. But these are things that stick in your mind
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, they certainly would.
Mm.
Now we're going to fast gear a bit here because most people, you've just said you were at the Royal Melbourne for a bit of time, but really 1998, which is graduation, and then 2 years later, you're starting back in motion.
Mm.
So before we get to that, when you graduated, did you have defined goals about what you were wanting to achieve in those early years as a physio?
Yeah, I certainly did. Um, doesn't mean that I achieved them. My intention was, honestly, my intention was just ground myself in some new graduate experiences as a rotating grade 1 therapist in the hospital. Wait the year or two for that to happen and for my wife to finish her graduate program as a nurse. And then we were out of here. Our objective was to go and live overseas. Like, we wanted to do the grass hut thing. We wanted to learn an unknown dialect. We wanted to work cold face as you could get with communities who didn't have access to primary healthcare. We wanted to be part of a team, and that we knew that wasn't a great career move as much as it just was a passion. Paulina, my wife, shared the passion. She grew up in Brazil. She'd seen abject poverty. She knew she'd been inside the favelas.
Mm.
She had compassion for the same things, and so we graduated thinking this is our path, and nobody could talk us out of it. And so we went to India, we went to Cambodia, we did all these little short trips. But we quickly realized, actually, you've got to fund yourself, Doug. Like, you've got to find sponsors for all this stuff. Volunteer work doesn't pay very well. And, we couldn't think of anything worse than being sent by a church or some humanitarian organization and being over there and getting into really valuable work only to have to come home halfway through because we've run out of cash. So actually, the dream and the reality didn't align, and we just didn't feel the opportunities presented. So yeah, in that first year or two, my goals were very much get the experience and get overseas. And
Yeah.
if I never came back, that would be a life well lived. That was kind of that was what I thought the Jason story would be.
So were there people, significant persons, like influencing this decision, or was this something that you felt was really grassrooted with you and your wife?
I think it was pretty grassrooted. The significant people in our life, be it our parents, some of the tutors at uni who I really connected to and became informal mentors, not just in physio, but in life. Um, and even some of our church pastors, right, who you would think would be right behind all this, with the best of intentions, I think they almost tried to discourage it because I think they felt we could do well with more experience, more maturity, more a bit more infrastructure, a bit more strategy around what we were thinking. Like, we were just foolhardy, headstrong,
Passionate.
passionate. Yeah. So actually, I think it was more grassroots, Paulina and me, and what we thought God had put us on this earth to do, frankly. And so we would work it out when we get there. Did we have all the answers? Absolutely not. Did it make sense? Very little. But we were prepared to risk it all. And we were young enough that if it all fell in a heap, well, we'd just regroup and go again.
Yeah.
That was kind of like that, the attitude, right?
Well, that makes sense. The only thing I don't understand, probably for myself, is that I knew nothing, even though I had a certificate clinically, practically, experientially. I realized quite fast, as you say, your patient sits down in front of you and they're asking things of you and you're thinking, well, geez, I don't
Yeah.
actually know how to address this.
Yeah.
So
And that's probably why we said, oh, well, we'll do a couple of years in a major metropolitan teaching hospital, get well grounded. Again, a bit of naivete, right? Because we think a couple of years is going to equip us. But then I guess on the other side, we weren't going, our intentions weren't to go overseas solo. We wanted to be part of a medical team. I might have been the only physio, but I would have been amongst a lot of wise heads. Um, but you don't think about all that, Doug. You just
Well, that's the thing
you're
is,
being way too rational.
well, yeah, I asked the question because on the podcast, it's interesting. Like people fall often into one of two groups, and they either straight from school go to uni
Yeah,
and probably, as you say, and as I was, quite immature and just laissez-faire and just do what you want to do. And there's a few loose goals, but there's nothing particularly specific about it. And then there's the other group that maybe come to physio late or through another pathway, and they are very goal driven. You know, their goal is not to just finish physio. They've got goals the next 5 years, either to catch up or to specialize or to get ahead.
yeah,
And it's just an interesting perspective. I think from listening to lots of different people, I think it comes down to that age, that there's a maturity aspect that as a
yeah.
new grad coming from high school, you don't have it generally. Where if
Mm.
you've done a previous degree or a previous career, when you make that choice, physio is your thing, they get into it with all wheels burning. I just had wonder where you sat, because that leads in the next thing, like literally 2 years after graduating and all these diversionary trips, you did start back in motion. And I think for younger audiences, this is of interest because why did you do that and not say go and work for another practice and
Yeah,
literally get some experience? Like what was happening then?
yeah. If I want to be sensational about this, I felt like I got railroaded. I didn't want to start back in motion. It wasn't my idea. In fact, on my wedding day, I said to Paulina, "You can relax. I'm never going to own my own practice. I'm never going to bring that sort of stress into our world. That's not. This is not. It was almost an informal prenup that we weren't going to do this. I didn't have a commercial bone in my body. Even if I had an entrepreneurial paradigm, risk-taking, ideas person, willing to risk everything, I didn't have the commerciality to be attracted to running business. But what did happen? So within 18 months of working in the hospital, I took a job in a private practice as an associate for somebody else. And that was really just to, again, diversify my experience and try and get a little bit of both worlds. And that was probably the first step across the dark line, right, to the dark side. I had a look at some research options. I did some teaching in the university at Melbourne. So I had this kind of mosaic of experiences, and they're all part-time experiences now because I'm just trying to get as much under my belt as I can. And my experience, I worked in 2 private practices for a year, both of them very different experiences, and demoralizing for different reasons. One was a single practice owner. I was his first employee after 10 years. Lovely guy, great clinician, terrible businessman. Just didn't know how to run a profitable enterprise, such that I did more vacuuming and dusting than treating patients because he didn't have enough clients coming in to meet the demand. So I quickly moved on from there. And then I went to the big sports medicine center and worked in a reputable place with good referrals, elite sporting teams. I worked with Australian weightlifting, junior soccer national championships, like getting all that cliche sports and spinal experience. But the culture there was horrible. And the way they treated their staff was terrible. So I actually resigned. So here's me coming to answer your question. I resigned from that job with no other position available and went home and laid on the couch for 6 weeks saying to Paulina, I think I'm done. I think I'm ready to go. And no door opened, no opportunity presented. Friends and family wanted to be treated. So I started looking after them in the carport at home. I just mocked up a little treatment room, had a secondhand ultrasound and a portable massage bed, and I just for $30 would give you a 30 or 60-minute treatment. Within 4 months of doing that, Doug, this thing was wall-to-wall patients, like 6 o'clock in the morning through to 11 o'clock at night. This thing's on. It's an accidental success. And even then, I would say, if you had asked, oh, yeah, I'm only going to do this as a tie-over strategy. This is a hobby business. This is me just waiting till we get overseas, but it's paying the bills in the meantime. I didn't even know what I had started until not even a year, like I think 8 months into it. Paulina comes to me and she says, you cannot have this many cars in the driveway. This is our home. Neighbors are complaining. You don't have permits. There's no waiting room, like the dogs jumping all over these old ladies. Like I had orthopedic surgeons referring their post-op patients to me and then getting phone calls saying, oh, didn't know it was at your house. Like it was humble. It was embarrassing. So she said to me, either do it properly or don't do it all, but you can't be in the middle. And so that was when we said, okay, looks like we're going to run a business. Going to do it with intent. And I don't know if you want me to get there yet, but I spent the next 3 or 4 years bitter about this because it's not the life I wanted. I was stuck. I was stuck in a business, in a practice that I didn't want, that was succeeding, but I didn't care because it was taking me off my life mission, right? That I thought I was meant to be pursuing. And so I was a very reluctant participator in my own business.
Well, here's an interesting question then. What was your vision for Back in Motion in the initial phase?
Pay the mortgage.
Yeah.
Just pay the mortgage. Give me enough money to get the plane ticket to get overseas. Like if you're talking, like, I'm being crude, right? I did not have, this vision of a national group, of a brand that we put up in New Zealand, hundreds of staff. Nah, not at all. This was just a means to an end. I wanted to give good clinical care. Like every patient who walked in and saw me, I had, like most physios, I think we deliver our craft with a high degree of excellence and pride. Like we value what we do. We know we can make a difference. So I don't think I was being disingenuous with Mrs. Jones at 8:30 on a Monday morning for her consult. But behind that, this was really just a ticket to medical missions. But something shifted. There was definitely a shift.
So when did the facade crack through and you realize that the external was actually meeting the internal? What
3 or
happened
4
then?
years. 3 or 4 years later. So I got dragged along kicking and screaming for 3 or 4 years. Like, by this stage, we're $1 million plus business. We're in a medical, proper medical rooms. I've got maybe, I don't know, 7 physios working for me, and I'm hating it. Like I would have given it to you, Doug. If you had asked for it, I would have given it to you.
No, thanks.
But
how did you keep going? Like you're a man that's obviously true to convictions. Well, that's what comes through.
Yeah.
Wasn't this internally eating at you? Like
Absolutely.
this disparity between what you were doing or what you wanted to do?
Every day. I call it the long, dark night of the soul. For 4 years, getting up every day, persisting, trying to learn the business of something I didn't have any long-term aspiration for, hoping, praying, believing that any minute now there'll be purpose discovered and I'll be able to leapfrog and, springboard from this into the next. That was the only hope that kept me going. But, my emotional health or my hopefulness was deteriorating.
Yeah.
And so it did get to a crisis point. Like I burnt out at 24 years of age. I call it my quarter life crisis. Like, I was barely halfway into my first decade as a physio, and I'm like, I'm done. I'm not going to keep doing this. So this is what I literally did, mate. I bought a combi van. I shaved my head. I gave the keys of the practice to a Kiwi who had flown over to take the job. And we chartered a trip around Australia. And for the next 3 or 4 months, my objective was to rediscover what I'm doing with my life. Like, this was the Blues Brothers, right? Like, try and find your mission from God again, because I was lost. I was really, really broken, and I'm 24. Like, how embarrassing! Didn't get very far, and so I actually thought the business would fail in my absence, and then I could come home and blame it on someone else and say, "Oh well, can't do that anymore," and move on to the next. But a funny thing, mate, the business kept growing without me. Like, I would call into every service station thinking, I wonder if there's enough money to pay for the next tank of fuel. And the bank balance just got bigger and bigger and bigger. This thing was growing without me. And I would have what I would say my second most defining moment up in Darwin. We'd just come out of Kakadu. We're walking along the beach. There's a big electrical storm brewing in the background. Paulina and I aren't really talking, but I am heavy-hearted. Like, I am feeling the weight of the world on me. And I'm complaining internally. I'm having this wrestle. Why am I stuck here doing this thing? And I'm going to have to go home eventually. Like, Paulina's got work. I've got to go home and face the music on all this. And I actually felt like God said to me, well, you can go overseas then if you want. Like, stop the whinging. If that's what you really want, go and do it. And it was like a pause. And this is all just happening in my mind, right? There's like a pause. And then I felt like he gave me an alternative. He said, or you could drive back to Melbourne. You could learn, like, intentionally study the business of healthcare. And you could build an ethically profitable, scaled business on the raw fundamentals of what is happening right now. It's growing without you. And you could generate enough revenue, enough surplus, that you could not only go overseas yourself, but you could send teams of other people, and you can be the sponsor, you can be the donor, you can be the guy who equips many, many more impacts than you could just have as a single soldier on your own. And honestly, Doug, at that point, something flicked in my head. I did not need any convincing. And since that day to this, it's like I'm a different guy. I just caught the vision, the passion of an alternative strategy for the same end. And I went just as hard on business as I would have previously gone just as hard on some sort of missional philanthropic venture, because I can see the purpose in it, right? And that was my second most critical kind of pivot point in the whole story.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I remember once, like most males enjoying sport, what's your career decisions? Oh, I want to be a phys ed teacher. And my mum was an English teacher. And she said, do you really want to be out there in the sun running around teaching kids that can't do this, can't do that, or whinging about this, whinging about that sport? Or do you want to just enjoy your sport and be doing something else? And the same thing for me, outdoors is a passion of mine.
Yeah.
And I did outward bound and tall ship sailing and a lot of scouts and that sort of stuff. And again, it was like, oh, I'll be an outward bound instructor and I'll travel the world doing that.
Mm.
And again, the voice of reason, my mum came back and said, well, would you rather have a profession and, earn the money so that you can then go and do that at your own whim and will and where you want and when you want, and not have to be putting up hoochies and wiping the ass of diarrhea clients and all that sort of stuff. And it's like, well, yeah, okay, I see the point behind it. So you really need to be able to link satisfactorily in your own mind what it is your passion is and how you're going to enable that. And I guess I'm kind of surprised to some extent that you didn't say earlier on, well, let's just sell the back in motion and invest the money and then utilize that to do our missionary work.
Yeah.
But obviously that wasn't an option. And the better option is don't kill the golden goose, but keep it producing, and it gives you a long-term revenue stream, I guess.
Well, one, I don't know if I would have been smart enough to do all that back then, Doug. Number two, practices are hard to sell, especially small ones, privately owned ones that, have an owner dependency. And number three, I think after that little interaction up in Darwin, I think I realized this is an economic engine that is going to fund more than I could have ever dreamed and if done properly, almost perpetually, because there's free cash generated in the business every year. So it's a tap that we'll be able to there's so much benefits that come from that. So I don't claim any genius to that, actually. Again, I just say I'm so grateful that at my lowest point, when I felt like I was almost about to run away and abandon, and I was pretty hopeless at that point. I feel like I got rescued. And the great thing is, and of course, we all have up days and bad days, but the great thing is, since that day, my conviction has not fundamentally shifted. You ask me why I do what I do now, it's for all the reasons when I was 10 years old, but I'm just doing it through a vehicle I could never have imagined.
What skills did you not have that you realized you needed to start to flesh out this new vision of growing a bigger organization?
All of them. I needed all of them. I didn't have any of them. I think, I mean, that's a bit of an unhelpful answer. I think what I was confident as a clinician. I really was, even though I was relatively inexperienced. I'd done well at school. I'd done well at uni. I had a good memory. I felt like I understood the core principles of diagnosis, treatment. I think I intuitively understood the value of relationships, and so treated patients as people, and that carried me a long way. So I think that part, the actual physical, literal craft of physiotherapy, I felt was defendable, even if there was mountains still to learn. But on the business side, oh my gosh, I needed to learn all of it. I had no financial literacy. I didn't understand branding and marketing. I didn't know what my IR, HR obligations were. Like when it comes to technology, I felt like I was the biggest technophobe out there. Like I was just reluctant and hesitant to go that path. I was non-confrontational. I didn't like disputation. And so if I had a staff member who disagreed with me, I'd curl up into a ball and suck my thumb. I was ill-equipped on a lot of that stuff. So I had to learn from the ground up. But what are you going to do when you're passionate and determined and there's purpose behind it? I mean, what are you going to do? You're just going to keep climbing every wall. And so, it was hard. Don't get me wrong. I mean, the next 5 years, that they were tough, really tough. Like we nearly went broke so many times. We borrowed all the money we could get our hands on. We made so many mistakes. I think I burnt so many relationships in my attempts to try and exercise some, newfound leadership and management that everybody told me I needed to be, and kind of got it wrong so many times before I started to get any of it right. Like, I'm not saying any of it was graceful or elegant. It was messy. It was messy. And I sometimes still talk to the people who worked for me way back then. And there are even patients who we still treat who saw me in the carport at home, and we laugh because it was just so horrible. I mean, I was so rough. But what are you going to do? You're going to keep persisting till you get it a little bit better, a little more right. And it's this gradual, incremental change over 25 years.
Well, I think that's important for young physios to hear, really, because they may see the success story and the final sale and the big money's made, but they don't realize that each step in a pathway, Steve Jobs started in a garage as well. And so a lot of these things, these ideas, it's you might see the final template, but to get there, the iterations and the basic lifestyle, I mean, it's just it's staggering what people have to go through to get to that point.
Yeah.
What would you say was one of the hardest decisions you had to make as a founder of Back in Motion?
I think, I can't ignore that the most controversial decision I ever made that caused me endless sleepless nights before I made it and years of endless pain after I made it is whether to franchise or not. like, that's the big obvious elephant in the room. I won friends and won enemies with that decision, right? The dirty F word, frankly. I remember and I've had a really good run with the APA for most of my career. I've worked really hard as an advocate for them. But I remember key people inside the APA ringing me and saying, you can't do that. Like, you can't franchise physio. I've had hate mail, not quite death threats. I've stood up at conferences and told part of our story wherever we were at that point in time, and been heckled, like people not even waiting for a microphone, but just standing up in opposition because they feel so offended that we would have franchised, as though they know what franchising is, as though people just see franchising of the devil, as though either it can't work and therefore we're bastardizing the purity of our profession, or it's evil, malicious, greedy intent because it's a commercialization strategy. Either way, people just didn't like it. And so that was by far the biggest decision I've had to make. Do I or don't I? And if I do, will I stick with it when the heat gets turned up? And
Did you anticipate that the heat was going to come? Like, was that okay?
Yeah,
Because
I was stepping on. I knew I was stepping on a landmine.
Yeah, all right. And how do you know that? Like, again, young physios listening to this are just not going to appreciate the gravity of what you're saying, because at the time, as you say, physio is seen as a purity, almost like we should be giving our services away for free.
Yeah.
And A, the fact you're charging for it is almost immoral, and B, the concept of multiplicity, and franchising was probably going to fall under that you're going to make money out of other people.
Yeah.
But they just don't. And to me, it's easy to look back on now and say, well, that seems pretty ridiculous, because if you're not making money, you can't provide a service. And if you're not providing a service, then what's the point of having a profession? So, in hindsight, it's so simple, but people have got to realize that you were literally the first person taking this concept to a commercial scale. And it's obviously on the beachfront, it was very uncomfortable for you.
Oh, yeah. First guy through the door always gets shot, right? So
I can put my hand up to that one as well, I think.
Yeah. So I knew I was stepping on a landmine because, one, it had never been done before. So anytime you're going to do something new or different, even if it's noble, it's already an assault to the intelligentsia of the profession who have come before you because they didn't think to do it. So straight away, you've got innate opposition just because nobody else thought or were willing to do it, even if it's a great idea. But secondly, anyone who I consulted, I had a rich network of people in the profession whose opinion I really valued, and I needed their input. And so when I kind of circled the wagons and took the counsel of many, I found nobody who endorsed it. Nobody who said this is going to be easy or well received. And so I knew when I did it, I would be attracting a lot of controversy. But here's the thing. I'd tried so many other things. Franchising was my last resort. You said before, if you make money out of your business, well, then that's probably good for the long term, right? Because I've never met a staff member, I've never met a physio who doesn't want to earn more money. I've never met a patient who doesn't want better facilities and more complete evidence-based, state-of-the-art, best practice services. And all of that has to come from a viable model that has enough fat in it that everybody gets their benefit. And small practice in Australia was doomed. Like, the model was unviable. I mean, I had done the research. Most small practice owners were better off putting their money in an ING account and earning their 3 or 4% interest than they were putting their mortgage at risk, running their business, not taking a wage consummate with what their staff were earning, and calling it a successful enterprise. So I knew I had to do something different. I'd tried partnerships. I'd looked at joint ventures. I'd played around with profit sharing. I'd looked at a staff equity scheme. Like I had turned over every rock. And you know what? At the end of the day, the only thing left standing that held any long-term hope was franchising, but not McDonald's. This is the bit that gets me, right. People just think, oh, you're just taking the lowest common denominator of the profession and you're flipping burgers out the back and you call that quality. No, 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 no. The thing about franchising is it is the purest form of partnership. It is literally saying we can pool resources, we can centralize services so that there is an economy of scale, but we can leave the human experience, the patient interaction to those who know best, which is at the coalface, in the consult room, on the phones, at the local practice. And we all only will win if every individual within the stakeholder group does their part. And so we had to build our own franchise concept, which was not like a ready-made retail model. We had to build one for healthcare and professional services, which hadn't been done before. So it was controversial, mate. And I spent many years regretting it, thinking I'm not sure if this is going to work. I had to build over 35 practices before we even got to our tipping point, and all the money and time I'd invested just broke even. So right up until that point, I'm still second guessing myself. But the passion for the end game kind of kept me there, even if I had a few wobbly moments.
So flipping that last question around, which was like, what was the hardest decision? We've pulled the elephant out of the room and we've put a spotlight on it. What would you say was one of the most rewarding aspects of starting business back in motion and going to a franchise model?
Well, the old cliche is people are the worst part of your business and people are also the best part of your business. So the greatest pain I've felt in all of this is broken relationships, of which, mea culpa, I have got just as much to own in the disappointing outcomes of some of those. But the biggest reward has been the culture of our people, like the army of back in motion physios and support staff who have just signed up for the cause. Like they believe in wanting to be significant. Like we launched our own foundation 10 years in, and our staff would volunteer their time and we'd fly them in and fly them out of remote communities around Australia. And we built hospitals in Burma and we did stuff in Thailand. And we've got all these amazing experiences, but without the people, it wouldn't have been possible because the money is inert. It has no promise unless it equips people. It's the people who do the work. And so I'm just so proud of our people. So the most fulfilling bit is even now, whilst I've moved past running back in motion, to be able to get on the phone and spend time with those who were part of our journey is absolutely a rewarding and very fulfilling part, because that's the essence of our life, isn't it? The connections that we make.
Yeah. Well, the hardest thing is always the best thing.
It is. It is.
It's so true.
You got to pay the highest price for the greatest reward.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean I don't have regrets. It doesn't mean people had to suffer for me to get there, but I wish I'd learned some of my lessons a lot sooner. But, this is the fragility of the human experience.
Yeah. Now, we've been talking about back in motion, but in 2017, you sold a couple of other businesses that you had founded, Revita and Active Workplace, which you had for 7 and 10 years respectively. And they're kind of focusing on the health and wellbeing of seniors. And you also completed your training as a director, Australian Institute of Company Directors.
Yeah.
Were these changes reflecting a shift in your interest and focus at that particular time?
Yeah, I think so. So I've sat on many boards in the last 10 years. So the first 10 years, it was like all consuming, just build back in motion. In the second half of my career to date, I've understood how much more I still need to learn. And when you're the owner of your own business, whilst you learn from experience, I'd much rather learn from other people's. Like a smart guy learns from his mistakes. A really wise one learns from the other person's mistakes. So I thought I got to get exposed to other organisations, and I think I had some value to give. So I started joining some boards, some healthcare boards, some charitable boards. I jumped on an ASX listed company in dentistry and worked with a guy who was doing something similar to us, but in a non-competing channel. So that's why I did the AICD course, and I think that's been really good, re-engineering of what good frameworks and governance and accountability looks like in a commercial context. So that was useful. I think the reason we sold those two other specialty brands was because I realized every business needs an exit strategy. Like, I'm not going to live forever. And when I'm ready to cash out, it doesn't mean it's the best time to. I never want to be desperate to sell. And so it just happened that the aged care market was hitting its peak, at the top of the bubble. And we had lots of interest in the business. And internally, it felt like a bit of a distraction to us, and we weren't ready to go the next iteration of it. So we sold it at a record price, and a year or two later, we would have got maybe 70 cents in the dollar on it. So it proved to be a really good choice. And similarly with Active, it was a workplace occupational health business. It wasn't our core. It made up probably less than 10% of our total group revenues. And so I just felt like, let's make life a little simpler. Let's be great at less things. Even though I had all of these ideas and how we could do more, it was kind of like, actually, by doing less, you do more. So yeah, we sold them, put more capital into the business. It enabled us to go do more overseas philanthropic projects, which is the whole reason we're in it anyway. And so it kind of just made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And taught me some stuff, actually selling businesses teaches you how to run businesses. So I think actually selling those two brands, and they sold for, many, many millions. And so the level of rigor of the buyers, they were private equity purchases. And so the level of rigor they go through, it puts scrutiny on your business. So it teaches you about your business, which means when I went back into the back in motion tent, I was more insightful around not only how we could run our business better from the scrutiny that we'd just had over us, but also how to ready it for sale when its time would be one day due, even if I couldn't predict it then. So it was good experiences.
Yeah. Which leads into 2021 when you did sell Back in Motion to Healthier for a healthy sum of money, of course, and you stayed on as an advisor. But I wanted just to ask a question retrospectively that I thought about was like, do you think the capacity, was Back in Motion something of an era? Do you think it could be done again, someone starting from a garage now, or has that moment passed?
There's always two forces at work. There's the external and there's the internal. I think, and I know some people who are in their 20s who are very, very passionate, very, very gifted physios, and more importantly, very determined. And I think internally they have everything they need, if not much more than I ever had, in terms of the get up and go and the conviction to do it again and maybe do it better and maybe go bigger. So I've got no doubt it's possible. And then you've got the external forces, funders, culture in the profession, competitive market and landscape. Like we started at pre-GFC. We got 110% funding for every new practice we launched. I mean, that's not possible today. So you need deep pockets. You need a lot of capital to do what we ended up doing, right? You need a lot more capital today of your own than you would have then. Otherwise, you've got to bring in investors. I was a sole shareholder, sole director right to the very end. I had not a single investor. I don't think I could do it today without investors because banks won't give me the debt funding that I was able to get pre-GFC.
Mm.
You've got a lot more consolidation in the market now. So, Back in Motion was the biggest for all of its time, or, for the second half of its tenure. But now you've seen the aggregation of which we've participated in, and the likes of ASX listed vehicles who are now running integrated healthcare services. That makes it a lot harder for a little guy on the corner street to scale up. Not impossible, but they're external forces that stack up against you. The most I had when I started was Life Care and H&A, if you remember them, Health Networks Australia, and they had probably 30 or 40 practices between them and were the leaders in any scaling up initiative. But they had their problems, and so I was able to take advantage and provide an alternative to that. Not necessarily better, but an alternative. Better is in the eye of the beholder. So could it get done today? I think yes, but their model would have to be different. Their model would have to be different. It would have to adapt to the new external environment.
Yeah. Now you've taken, or you had a role, I'm not sure if it's still current now, but when you sold Back in Motion to Healthy for $60 million, you had a role and a commitment to be an advisor. What does that look like? And I'm thinking for people in career progressions,
Yeah.
what does an advisor do? Are we talking simply like a board member type role?
Yeah, so I'd attend their board meetings without all the formalities of being a registered director, which meant I could speak into their decisions, give them historical context, help them understand why we, as Back in Motion, had made various strategic decisions so that they're not disrupted in the new world. Give them the benefit of that legacy, that insight, and where they were thinking of changing direction, try and help them calculate the cost, the risk of what that might break inside our business, because I had built it, so I knew all the intricacies of it. And because I'd done a lot of buying and selling of healthcare businesses over the 20 years, I think I was able to help advise on other target acquisitions and how to negotiate those and be part of bringing together the right people to continue their growth story. And look, let's be very pragmatic here. We might have sold the business for 67 million on the day, but actually there was $100 million in total value that had to be that could be realized over successive years of continued performance. And so, I had a vested interest to my franchisees and to our family with whom, this was, you only get to sell your business once. And so I wanted to make sure that we were protecting the interests of continued performance, because another $40 million goes a long way in the developing world. And so I kind of didn't want to just walk away and leave it be. And our franchisees, some of them had their houses on the line and had put 10, 20 years of effort into this. I wanted to make sure they got their full reward. And so my advisory service was a way of protecting all of that within limits.
Yeah. So Healthier kind of said to you, look, here's your upfront fee and we'll give you a tapering fee over years to secure that performance.
Yeah, so different. I mean, when you think about it, we had over 140 locations, but even at its most simplest level, we had 70 different practice entities. So think of companies or trusts that all had to transact to make this deal complete. Some of those had practices that had been trading for 10 years and were doing $2 million revenue and 28% profit and no problems. They're going to get all their money on day one because they're a safe and a secure purchase for Healthier. Other practices, and this is the complexity that people don't read in the AFR, they don't understand how all the mechanics work, but other practices we had launched in COVID. Like we launched a number of new businesses during COVID. They hadn't broken even yet. There was a capital expenditure that we'd invested. Doesn't matter how many multiples of profit you get. multiples of zero are still zero, and there was a risk for the purchaser as to whether this was going to be a liability or an asset. So around some of those businesses, we would ring fence and say, well, there's a price on day one, but then we need to see what happens on the first anniversary, the second anniversary, and the third anniversary. And so there's more earnings to enjoy as they realize their maturity. And I think that's a really reasonable way of doing it. It's just in a group as large as ours with a matrix of so many over and underperformers, we had to have a very complex set of terms. So in short, there was a big lump sum on day one. And then there was this staging of payments over the next 3 years.
Yeah, because you knew that these things would pick up. It just wasn't being shown up in the P&Ls at the time.
Exactly. Yeah.
So with the sale of Back in Motion, it would have freed up a lot of your time, I'm guessing, and you've taken on a couple of new chairmanships since then. Both of them are faith-based organisations that I'm thinking of. Halftime was one. And it talks about identifying key personal aspects around a central tenement of core, capacity, and context. When did you discover spirituality was a core value for you?
When I was 10.
So that
and I might not have and I might not have had all the vocabulary for it back then. Like if you asked me when I was 10, as a 10-year-old, I'm not sure I would have said, hey, I've decided spirituality is my core value. But that was a God experience for me. That was a very, it's hard to put words around it, right? Because we live in a material world and all these things are sensitive issues, and some people are religious and some aren't. And I'm okay with all of that. I'm totally comfortable with a diverse world, but I just can't ignore, I don't want to deny, for me, that was one of the most authentic divine experiences I've had. So I go back and I say something changed in me then. And then progressively over a lifetime, as I've lent into that and explored more of it and opened myself to it, then I just become more and more compelled, more convinced, more absorbed into it. So it is, I mean, if it's what you remember from today as being one of my identity or values, I'm totally okay with that, because it is a big part of who I am. It's the most part of who I am.
Yeah. What would you say are other core attributes for yourself?
Yeah. When you do all those personality profiling, and I've done heaps of them over the years, and you would have as well, doesn't matter whether it's DISC or Strength Finders or Myers-Briggs, there is a clear thread. And it's a dangerous one to admit, right? Because it's got a dark side as well as an upside. But I have a strong driver personality. So, ambitious, achiever, and it's just part of who I am. I was built that way. I was born that way. And so that's a pretty big part of my paradigm. If I'm not achieving, if I'm not taking ground, then I'm asking myself, why not? And there could be lots of very valid reasons why not. And so I have to be careful and gracious with myself, but I can't ignore. I want to take the next hill, like it's in me. And that's dangerous. That's a double-edged sword. That doesn't make me right. That makes me dangerous, because it means sometimes I'll do it at my own peril or at the peril of those who I love around me. And so it needs boundaries, but I certainly don't need much motivation, mate. I don't need much inspiration. I don't need much accountability. Like, I am driven. That would be a value. And then I'd probably, longevity is a value. And that's maybe a funny word to use, but actually I think about that a lot. Like, the longer I live, the more impact, the more positive difference I can make. I don't want to die young. Even though I ride motorbikes and I do some crazy things which kind of fly in the face of that, actually longevity matters to me. So I value health, physical, mental, spiritual. I want to sleep well, eat well, move well, all that stuff, which goes with our profession. But I want to keep relationships in good stead. I actually want to go the distance, and I want to finish well. I actually want to really finish well. I don't want to be one of these guys who just tapers off into obscurity and messes it all up in these final years. I actually want to close out with at my peak. And it sounds silly, but if I can get 100 years, mate, I'd be the happiest guy, because it just gives me longer on the clock to make a difference around the things that I really value. So that influences life choices for sure.
Do you say you're driven this? I mean, we've heard it from business, but does that apply to sport, to playing your guitar? Do you have to be the fastest guy on the highway and your motorbike? Does it overflow into everything, or is it targeted?
It probably does, shamefully. It probably spills out on the Monopoly board with the kids. Even though you spend most of your adulthood trying to restrain those ugly expressions of it. So I think there is a competitiveness in me. I play a lot of tennis, and we're old timers getting out there running around this court, and we're nowhere near as good as we think we are, but we're going to go hell for leather, mate. We're going to put it. We're going to be absolutely exhausted. We can barely walk to the car on the way back, and I don't know why we do that to ourselves. I think I have an extreme personality in that regard. But I do have good people. My wife would be chief amongst them, but others, mentors, who are forever trying to help me calibrate, because knowing that that's my tendency, a wise person would moderate it, right? And so I spend so much energy trying to suppress the unhealthy extremes of that. I actually do a lot to suppress it. Like I do a lot of reflection every day. I try and think carefully about whether this is who I really want to be. And so I think over the years, I've developed a little bit more restraint around some of those extremes. So if I ride the bike out there with a group of 6 guys, I'll happily be in the middle of the pack or at the tail, and I'll just enjoy their enjoyment. But it's a conscious decision, actually. I actually decide, you know what, I'm just going to hang back today. I'm just going to ride at the back of the pack. I don't have to be up front making all the decisions. I think learning how to follow is a beautiful journey to go on, and equips you in leadership attributes that surprise you. But you actually need to be a great follower to be a great leader. And I think I've realized in the last 10 years, I actually want to follow others. I don't have to have the vision for all this. A lot of the humanitarian projects that we're involved in overseas, I'm not the leader of them. I'm just a member of the team. I'm maybe the funder or sit on the board of it, and I'm following someone else's vision. They've got boots on the ground, and it's good to learn to be a great follower, a contributor, but a follower.
Yeah, I'd give a bushwalking analogy there, that you can see a lot from the front for sure, but it's interesting when you're at the back, you can see a lot more, and that involves the team. Like you get to see who's lagging, who's not consciously aware of what they're doing, and they're not refreshing themselves with fluids and food, and you can pick up a lot. So there's a bit of analogy there too. Hey, look, your strip line is lead with conviction.
Yeah.
Now, when people in the clinical situation, in my case, they'll often sort of say, look, I just can't get motivated. I just don't have the motivation to do this. And I jokingly say, well, get into the filing cabinet and look under the M and you'll find motivation there. Do you think conviction is the same? Like there's no easy way, rather it comes from a process of like reflection and goal evaluation and then making that conscious decision to implement something with conviction?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of tributaries into the main flow of conviction. But I am fond of saying the person with the most energy wins every time. And so if you're just turning up to the job and it's just a paycheck, it's just a stepping stone, it was just because it was close to home, or it was the only employer that said yes to you, then it is not a good grounding for you to make your best contribution to the workplace, to the team, to the profession, to the patient sitting in front of you. So you need conviction. Conviction is belief. This idea that I don't need other people to inspire me. I can generate my own internal energy because there is such a passion for what I'm doing, even when others get in my way or say I can't or put restraints on me. I will find a way because this is part of what I'm born to do. So I always say to people, if you don't know what your convictions are, like if you can't articulate them, it doesn't mean you don't have them. It just means you haven't done the work yet to discover them. But I like to think about what makes you mad, what makes you sad, and what makes you glad, just to be a little poetic. What makes you mad, sad, and glad? Like if you start focusing, even in just a purely professional or career context, or even as finite as just the job you are working in, what makes you mad, sad, and glad? Chances are you have a conviction that is influencing those emotive responses. And as you tune into it, as you distill it, and identify what that conviction or series of truths are that you really believe in, that you're not prepared to compromise, boy, it makes you a force to be reckoned with in terms of how you then behave, attitude, behavior, commitment, the ABCs of making a contribution. So I try not to let it be too mystical, like it doesn't have to be this great mystery. But a series of good questions like that, I think, helps people at least start down the right rabbit holes.
What would you say has been your hardest lesson that you've learned so far? I was going to say as a physio, which I'll stick with, but maybe just as a health professional, because you've spanned clinician, business owner, board director, advisor, you go on the gamut. What would you sort of say has been the hardest lesson you've learned?
Well, one of the lessons that comes to mind is, let me say emphatically, I've learned that success does not make you popular. Success, anyway, is a very, it's a bowl of jelly. Like, it's so hard to frame, define what you call success, what I call success. It's a nebulous concept. It's far from a standardized experience. And so I just caution the pursuit of quote unquote success. And anyway, even if you achieve your desirable success, don't think it'll make you popular. And popularity isn't actually the goal. It'd be a nice side benefit. And it doesn't mean there aren't people who are going to slap you on the back and congratulate you for your achievements, but for everything you succeed at, you'll displace somebody somewhere from an opinion perspective or whatever, and it won't always make you popular. So I think the biggest thing I've latched onto, and this isn't my discovery, this is something somebody shared with me, and in no small way influenced me wanting to invest into the Halftime organization and now be chair of, is this little idea that you want to be successful, but that's just a means to an end, and the end is significance. Significance is a far higher, noble cause. Success is the reward you get for your hard work, for you, your family, those closest to you. But significance is the impact you make on others. And so I think for me, just differentiating between those two in the maze of life, in the cut and thrust of every day, 9 to 5, there's a lot of noise. I like asking myself, am I pursuing success or am I chasing significance? And I want to keep recalibrating to the latter. That's probably my biggest learning as a husband, as a father, as a business owner, physio. Yeah, I keep coming back to that.
That's a good distinction. It almost makes me think of the persistent pain type analogy where we're trying to educate our patients on what's the difference between a hurt and a harm. Like it might sound very similar, but when you sit down and just go through it bit by bit with them, they really get that gist, like, okay, the hurt's the experience of pain, but the harm is actually if it's doing something that I need to be aware of and recalibrate. And
yeah,
that can be a light bulb moment for them as well. And I think that, we can get probably tied up with success, but really the significance or the legacy or the helping of others is more important. And professionally, that should ring true for us too, because, we're doing something at the moment on the South Coast. There's a massive marine park, which is going to extend from Bremer Bay to the South Australian border, which is about 1,000 kilometres. And there's always those people that aren't happy with the concept of sanctuary zones and I can't fish there and I can't do what I used to do.
Yep.
But my conversation just turns around, well, the more important person in this conversation hasn't actually been born yet. This park is about the grandkids and the great grandkids having the opportunity to experience what we have had the pleasure to experience. And we're really doing this for them. It's not about us. And so it's looking beyond, looking at the significance of it rather than the success, I guess, which is what you've been saying.
Yeah, it's good.
For $200 or less, what's the best book or app or other tool or investment that you've made that's helped you in your development?
Well, for $200, you can buy 3 books at least. So the 3 books that I reckon have influenced me the most in terms of a career and professional sense would be Michael Gerber's book, which is called The E-Myth. Number 2 would be John Maxwell, who is a prolific author on all things leadership. And my favorite of his titles would be The 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, because it basically just condenses his whole philosophy and leadership into one read. And the third, to give it another mention here, is the Halftime book, because I read all 3 of those books inside the first 5 years of me starting back in motion. And I'm still buying 20 or 30 copies of them a year, 15 years later, handing them out to people when they're asking me, because they resonate, they still hold true. And I think they had some of the greatest aha moments for me. And I reread them multiple times. So, yeah, there you go. Under $100, you can get all of that.
Yeah, get 2 copies and give one to your best friend.
Yeah. Then you've got something to talk about at the next pub meal.
What would you say has been your most out on a limb decision that you've made, and what was the outcome of that? Now, I'm guessing there's one you could say, but
yeah. Well, I mean, we've already talked about franchising, so that would have been the one of many. To be honest, Paulina and I still giggle over the fact that when we launched our practice in the carport, and I say launched, but all I did was get out of my pajamas that morning and go treat the next door neighbor. But I had to buy $329 worth of consumables, tubes of anti-inflammatory creams, some TheraBands, some other bandage wraps, whatever, right? Ultrasound gel, whatever. And I remember her looking at me and saying, "Are we ever going to get this money back?" Like we were newlyweds. And it seemed like an awful lot of money, and I didn't have a job.
Yeah.
And so
I can see that conversation.
That was putting my butter out there on the line. I think any time we have closed a practice, I've really grieved over that. So there's been a half a dozen of them over 20 years where we've just got it wrong. But, you've got so many sunk costs and ego and confidence that you pull through this, that you keep delaying a decision like that. And all it does is keep exposing you. And eventually you've got to take your medicine and, deal with it. And then I would say, the most recent massive risk was whether we do the deal with Healthier. Like, that's a big deal. I actually gave my golden goose away. Now, they gave me a more than fair price in return. Don't get me wrong. Deal was amazing. I think we set a record in healthcare in terms of transaction records. But, I realize now I've got to be a really good steward of all that money, because I've got to take it for as far as I can. I've got to invest it well so that it keeps generating returns, so that we can keep doing the work that is so important overseas and in our country, because I'll never get to sell it again like this. I get one shot at it. So that was a pretty high risk, and I spent 2 years deliberating that.
Yeah. Now that we're in a reflective mood, if you could step back to your younger self, what 3 bits of advice would you like to share, knowing what you now know?
Well, you kind of picked up on one of them. So I'll give you that one straight up. And that is, I wish I understood earlier that pain and hardship is a gift that builds resilience and isn't something to run away from. It's taken me a long time to embrace pain as being an opportunity rather than a setback. And so, I've got 4 kids. So this becomes a theme of our dinner time conversations on a regular basis. I wish I had learnt it at their age and not seen pain as the enemy. The struggle, there's a great metaphor. I won't go into it now, but I'm sure most people have heard it or read it about the caterpillar who has to bust out of its cocoon. Like, if you don't struggle, then you'll end up dying, malnourished, ill-equipped for the flight of life. So I think that's one big lesson. I think because I am a very task-driven, process-orientated, achieving type personality, I think I would have fared much better in life if I had learnt earlier the value of relationships and people. So, I mean, I'm convinced of, right, people above all else. But it doesn't mean I've lived according to that all the way. And I think if I could coach the younger Jason, it would be, hey, just remember, buddy, people above all else. Everything else is recoverable. People, they are too precious. So relationships first would be a second. And maybe as a distant third, I would say comparison is the enemy of contentment. So as a young guy, rather than spending all my time comparing myself to what my peers were doing, and then what as a teenager, and then as a young adult, and then as a business owner, and as a physio, like, what's everyone else doing? Being preoccupied. Am I doing okay? Where do I sit in the pecking order? Am I on track? I think it just breeds discontent with being grateful for everything you have. You can always find someone who's got more and gone further, but you can just as easily find people who are lagging behind or had greater hardships. And so I just think comparison, it doesn't breed the healthy gratitude I want. I just want to be so thankful and joyful for what I do have. And it doesn't temper my motivation to go for more. Like, it doesn't dilute my ambition. It doesn't make me mediocre. It just makes me content. And content is a beautiful attribute. I think actually contentedness gives me the solid bedrock to be able to take risks, to do some other things. So I think comparison has probably slowed me down over the years. So the younger Jason could do with a bit of a coaching lesson around that one.
Yeah, it's almost the antithesis to gratitude, isn't it? If you're grateful for what you've got, you won't be worried about comparing yourself with others.
Yeah.
Looking forward, where do you see, or where would you like to see the physio profession heading in the next few years?
I think for many years now, and this is both in my capacity as the owner of Back in Motion and seeing, the waves of graduate reform happen over the last decade, and in my advocacy roles with the APA and at universities, I think I've formed a very clear view that the new decade, the next generation of physios, if they could be nurtured into an appreciation of 3 critical deliverables, we could actually have a revolution, a wonderful revolution on our hands. And so for me, the 3 are, and the first is obvious, clinical excellence. We always want to be beyond reproach as clinicians, being the craft with which we are empowered and licensed to do. I actually think we're starting to expose ourselves more and appreciate the value of true leadership attributes. So if our students and our new grads and our young generation of physios are nurtured, mentored, just encouraged in becoming better leaders. It's one of the best clinical skill they'll ever develop, but it gives them a life skill, a professional skill. And then thirdly, I think, at least for half the profession, but I would argue the entirety of it, we need more commercial paradigms for what we do. So even in the public sector, it's a business. It's a profit and loss statement. You got to deliver value for money. Like, there's capital invested. You've got to give taxpayers a good outcome. So I think if we want to be able to stand in front of regulators and health insurers and government legislators, and we want to advocate for the good that physio can do in the next 10 years, we have to have a commercial model, we have to have a leadership model, and we have to have a clinical model. And it's in the sweet spot of those three that I would have hope for our profession moving forwards. And I'm optimistic. I'm realistic. I think we've got some work to do, but I think there's some voices that are starting to reinforce those messages, which is good.
Yeah. And where do you see yourself focusing on for the next few years?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm probably now starting to exercise the second half of my career more as a health advocate. So I'm still very passionate for physios and our profession and wanting to see us do well and be our best. So that'll take on many different forms, but probably behind the curtain as I help coach and mentor and just add value into various projects that our peak bodies and key leaders within the industry, as they pursue their assignments and projects, then I think I can add value there. But I think, 80% of my work, my passion now, is to be the missional philanthropist, to use our war chest that we have been rewarded with to get on with doing more scaled, impactful work in Australia and overseas in those disadvantaged communities, which is why I got out of bed all those years ago. It's an amazing thing. Like, I pinch myself every day for the last 2 years, realizing I now get to do that almost full time, and I get to do it with my wife. And so that's a joy for us.
Yeah, well, you come that full circle, haven't you? You didn't get stuck by the wild coyote running off the cliff and dying. You're more struck by the young kid with a distended belly and the empty food bowl.
Yeah.
And that's driven your passion in your pathway, interestingly, to this culmination where you've got your money, you've got your goals, you've got your communities that you want to help.
Yeah.
And more importantly, now you can do it.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel really, really grateful, Doug.
Yeah, it's brilliant. Well, Jason, thank you so much for sharing your journey on Physio+10. It's certainly been one that does come that full circle, the circle of life. And I'm glad that you've been able to achieve, unknowingly to start with, but getting there in the end, what it is you wanted to do. And it's just so, it's just so awesome that you've done that. And yeah, thanks so much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, very grateful. Thanks, mate.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Physio+10, in which I trust you gained some valuable insights. It'd be awesome if you could leave your 2 cents worth as a review or rating of this podcast, and I look forward to sharing the story of another trailblazing physiotherapist with you in 2 weeks' time. Stay safe. Bye for now.